Tom Sawyer, Chapter 4. The sun rose upon a tranquil world and beamed down upon a peaceful village like a benediction. Breakfast over, Aunt Polly had family worship. It began with a prayer built up the ground up from solid courses of scriptural quotations, welded together with a thin mortar of originality, and from the summit of this she delivered a grim chapter of the Mosaic Law, as from Sinai. Then Tom girded up his loins, so to speak, and went to work to get his verses. Sid had learned his lessons days before. Tom bent all his energies to the memorizing of 5 verses. And he chose part of the Sermon on the Mount because he could find no verses that were shorter. At the end of half an hour, Tom had a vague general idea of his lesson, but no more, for his mind was traversing the whole field of human thought, and his hands were busy with distracting recreations. Mary took his book to hear him recite, and he tried to find his way through the fog. Blessed are the poor. Yes, poor. Blessed are the poor. In spirit. In spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for I don't know what it is. Shall mourn. Blessed are they that shall mourn, for they shall what? Why don't you tell me, Mary? What do you want to be so mean for? Oh, Tom, you poor thick-headed thing, I'm not teasing you. I wouldn't do that. You must go and learn it again. Don't be discouraged, Tom. You'll manage it. And if you do, I'll give you something ever so nice. There. Now that's a good boy. All right. What is it, Mary? Tell me what it is. Never you mind, Tom. You know if I say it's nice, it's nice. You bet you that's so, Mary. All right, I'll tackle it again. And he did tackle it again. And under the double pressure of curiosity and prospective gain, he did it with such spirit that he accomplished a shiny success. Mary gave him a brand new Barlow knife worth 12.5 cents. And the convolution of delight that swept his system took him to his foundation. True, the knife would not cut anything, but it was a sure enough Barlow, and there were inconceivable grandeur in that. Though where the Western boys ever got the idea that such a weapon could possibly be counterfeited to its injury is an imposing mystery and will always remain so, perhaps. Tom contrived to scarify the cupboard with it and was arranging to begin on the bureau when he was called off to dress for Sunday school. Mary gave him a tin basin of water and a piece of soap, and he went outside the door and set the basin on a little bench there. Then he dipped the soap in the water and laid it down, turned up his sleeves, poured out the water on the ground gently, then entered the kitchen and began to wipe his face diligently on a towel behind the door. But Mary removed the towel and said, "Now, ain't you ashamed, Tom? You mustn't be so bad. Water won't hurt you." Tom was a trifle disconcerted. The basin was refilled, and this time he stood over it a while, gathering resolution, took a deep breath, and began. When he entered the kitchen presently, with both eyes shut and groping for a towel with his hands, an honorable testimony of suds and water was dripping from his face. But when he emerged from the towel, he was not yet satisfactory. For the clean territory stopped short of his chin and his jaw like a mask. Below and beyond this line there were the dark expanse of unirrigated soil that spread downward in front and backward around his neck. Mary took him in hand, and when she was done with him, he was a man and a brother, without distinction of color, and his saturated hair was nearly brushed, its curly, short curls wrought into dainty and symmetrical general effect. He privately smoothed out the curls with labor and difficulty and plastered his hair close down to his head, for he held curls to be effeminate, and his own filled his life with bitterness. Then Mary got out a suit of clothing that had been used only for Sundays during 2 years. They were simply called his other clothes. And so by that, we knew the size of his wardrobe. The girl put him to rights after he had dressed himself. She buttoned his neat roundabout up to his chin, turned his vast shirt collar down over his shoulders, brushed him off, and crowned him with his speckled straw hat. He now looked exceedingly improved and uncomfortable. He was fully as uncomfortable as he looked, for there was a restraint about whole clothes and cleanliness that galled him. He hoped that Mary would forget his shoes, but the hope was blighted. She coated them thoroughly with tallow, as was the custom, and brought them out. He lost his temper and said he was always being made to do everything he didn't want to do. But Mary said persuasively, "Please, Tom, that's a good boy." So he got into the shoes, snarling. Mary was soon ready, and the 3 children set out for Sunday school, a place that Tom hated with his whole heart, but Sid and Mary were fond of it. Sabbath school hours were from 9 to 10:30, and then church service. 2 of the children always remained for sermon voluntarily, and the others remained too for stronger reasons. The church's high-backed, uncushioned pews would seat about 300 persons. The edifice was a small, plain affair with a sort of pine board tree box on top of it for a steeple. At the door, Tom dropped back a step and accosted his Sunday-dressed comrade. "Say, Billy, got a yeller ticket?" "Yes." "What'll you take for?" "What'll you give?" "Piece of licorice and a fish hook." "Let's see 'em." Tom exhibited. They were satisfactory, and the property exchanged hands. Then Tom traded a couple of white alleys for 3 red tickets and some small trifle, and another for a couple of blue ones. He waylaid other boys as they came and went on buying tickets of various colors, 10 or 15 minutes longer. He entered the church now with a swarm of clean and noisy boys and girls, proceeded to his seat, and started a quarrel with the first boy that came handy. The teacher, a grave elderly man, interfered, then turned his back a moment, and Tom pulled the boy's hair in the next bench and was absorbed in his book when the boy turned around, stuck a pin in another boy presently in order to hear him say ouch, and got a new reprimand from his teacher. Tom's whole class were a pattern, restless, noisy, and troublesome. When they came to recite their lessons, not one of them knew his verses perfectly, but had to be prompted all along. However, they worried through, and each got his reward in small blue tickets, each with a passage of scripture on it. Each blue ticket was pay for 2 verses of the recitation. 10 blue tickets equaled 1 red one, then could be exchanged for it. 10 red tickets equaled a yellow one. For 10 yellow tickets, the superintendent gave a very plainly bound Bible, worth 40 cents in those easy times, to the pupil. How many of my readers would have the industry and application to memorize 2,000 verses, even for a door Bible? And yet, Mary had acquired 2 Bibles in this way. It was a patient work of 2 years, and a boy of German parentage had won 4 or 5. He once recited 3,000 verses without stopping, but the strain upon his mental faculties was too great, and he was little better than an idiot from that day forth. A grievous misfortune for the school, for on great occasion before company, the superintendent, as Tom expressed it, had always made this boy come out and spread himself. Only the older pupils managed to keep their tickets and stick to their tedious work long enough to get a Bible. So the delivery of one of these prizes was rare and noteworthy circumstance. The successful pupil was so great and conspicuous for that day that on the spot every scholar's heart was fired with a fresh ambition that often lasted a couple of weeks. It is possible that Tom's mental stomach had never really hungered for one of those prizes, but unquestionably his entire being had for many a day longed for the glory and the eclat that came with it. In due course, the superintendent stood up in front of the pulpit and with a closed hymn book in his hand and his forefinger inserted between the leaves, and commanded attention. When a Sunday school superintendent makes a customary little speech, a hymn book in his hand is as necessary as is the inevitable sheet of music in the hand of a singer who stands forward on the platform and sings a solo at a concert, though why is a mystery, for neither the hymn book nor the sheet music is ever referred to by the sufferer. The superintendent was a slim creature of 35, with a sandy goatee and short sandy hair. He wore a stiff standing collar whose upper edge almost reached his ears and whose sharp points curved forward abreast of the corners of his mouth. A fence that compelled a straight look out ahead, and a turning of the whole body when a side view was required. His chin was propped on a spreading cravat which was as broad and as long as a banknote and had fringed ends. His boot toes were turned up sharply in the fashion of the day, like sleigh runners, an effect patiently and laboriously produced by the young men by sitting with their toes pressed against a wall for hours together. Mr. Walters was very earnest of mien and very sincere and honest of heart. He held sacred things and places in such reverence, and so separated them from worldly matters, that unconsciously to himself his Sunday school voice had acquired a peculiar intonation which was wholly absent on weekdays. He began after this fashion: "Now, children, I want you all to sit up just as straight and pretty as you can and give me all your attention for a minute or two. There, that's it. That is the way good little boys and girls should do. I see one little girl who's looking out of the window. I'm afraid she thinks I am out there somewhere, perhaps up in one of the trees, making a speech to the little birds." Applausive titter. "I want to tell you how good it makes me feel to see so many bright, clean little faces assembled in a place like this, learning to do right and be good," and so forth and so on. It is not necessary to set down the rest of the oration. It was of a pattern which does not vary and so it is familiar to us all. The latter third of the speech was marred by one resumption of fights and other recreations among certain of the bad boys, and by fidgeting and whispering what extended far and wide, washing even to the bases of isolated and incorruptible rocks like Sid and Mary. But now every sound ceased suddenly with the subsidence of Mr. Walters' voice, and the conclusion of the speech was received with a burst of silent gratitude. A good part of whispering had been occasioned by an event which was more or less rare, the entrance of visitors. Lawyer Thatcher, accompanied by a very feeble and aged man, a fine, portly, middle-aged gentleman with iron gray hair, and a dignified lady who was doubtless the latter's wife. The lady was leading a child. Tom had been restless and full of chafings and repining. Conscience smitten too, he could not meet Amy Lawrence's eye. He could not brook her loving gaze. But when he saw this small newcomer, his soul was set ablaze with bliss in a moment. The next moment he was showing off with all his might, cuffing boys, pulling hair, making faces, in a word, using every art that seemed likely to fascinate a girl and win her applause. His exultation had but one alloy, the memory of his humiliation in his angel's garden. And that record in sand was fast washed out under the waves of happiness that were sweeping over it now. Visitors were given the highest seat of honor, and as soon as Mr. Walter's speech was finished, he introduced them to the school. The middle-aged man turned out to be a prodigious personage, no one less one that the county judge, altogether the most august creation these children had ever looked upon, and they wondered what kind of material he was made of. And they half wanted to hear him roar, and they were half afraid he might too. He was from Constantinople, 12 miles away, so he had traveled and seen the world. These very eyes had looked upon the county courthouse, which was said to have a tin roof. The awe which these reflections inspired was attested by the impressive silence and the ranks of staring eyes. This was the great Judge Thatcher, brother of their own lawyer. Jeff Thatcher immediately went forward to be familiar with the great man and be envied by the school. It would have been music to his soul to hear these whisperings. "Look at him, Jim. He's going up there. Say, look, he's going to shake hands with him. He is shaking hands with him. By jigs, don't you wish you was Jeff?" Mr. Walters fell to showing off with all sorts of official bustlings and activities, giving orders, delivering judgments, discharging directions here and there, everywhere that he could find a target. The librarian showed off, running hither and thither with his arms full of books and making a deal of the splutter and fuss that insect authority delights in. The young lady teachers showed off, bending sweetly over pupils that were lately being boxed, lifting pretty warning fingers at bad little boys and patting good little ones lovingly. The young gentleman teachers showed off with small scoldings and other little displays of authority and fine attention to discipline, and most of the teachers of both sexes found business up at the library, but by the pulpit it was business that frequently had to be done over again 2 or 3 times with much seeming vexation. The little girls showed off in various ways, and the little boys showed off with such diligence that the air was thick with paper wads and a murmur of scuffling. And above it all, the great man sat and beamed a majestic judicial smile upon the house, and warmed himself in the sun of his own grandeur, for he was showing off too. There was only one thing wanting to make Mr. Walter's ecstasy complete, and that was a chance to deliver a Bible prize and exhibit a prodigy. Several pupils had a few yellow tickets, but none had enough. He had been around among the star pupils inquiring. He would have given worlds now to have that German lad back again with a sound mind. And now at this moment, when hope was dead, Tom Sawyer came forward with 9 yellow tickets, 9 red tickets, 10 blue ones, and demanded a Bible. There was a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. Walters was not expecting an application from this source for the next 10 years. But there was no getting around it. Here were the certified checks, and they were good for their face. Tom was therefore elevated to a place with the judge and the other elect, and the great news was announced from the headquarters. It was the most stunning surprise of the decade, and so profound was the sensation that it lifted the new hero up to the judicial one's altitude, and the school had 2 marvels to gaze upon in place of one. The boys were all eaten up with envy, but those who suffered the bitterest pangs were those who perceived too late that they themselves had contributed to this hated splendor by trading tickets to Tom for the wealth he had amassed in selling whitewashing privileges. These despised themselves as being the dupes of a wily fraud, a guileful snake in the grass. The prize was delivered to Tom with as much effusion as the superintendent could pump up under the circumstances. But it lacked somewhat of the true gush, for the poor fellow's instinct taught him that there was a mystery here that he could not well bear the light. Perhaps It was simply preposterous that this boy had warehoused 2,000 sheaves of scriptural wisdom on his premises. A dozen would strain his capacity without a doubt. Amy Lawrence was proud and glad, and she tried to make Tom see it in her face, but he wouldn't look. She wondered. Then she was just a grain troubled. Next, a dim suspicion came and went, came again. She watched. A furtive glance told her worlds, and then her heart broke. She was jealous and angry, and the tears came, and she hated everybody. Tom most of all, she thought. Tom was introduced to the judge, but his tongue was tied. His breath would hardly come, and his heart quaked, partly because of the awful greatness of the man, but mainly because he was her parent. He would have liked to fall down and worship him, if it were in the dark. The judge put his hand on Tom's head and called him a fine little man and asked him what his name was. The boy stammered, gasped, and got it out. Tom. Oh, no, not Tom. It's Thomas. Ah, that's it. I thought there was more to it, maybe. That's very well, but you've another one, dare say, and you'll tell it to me, won't you? Tell the gentleman your name, Thomas, said Walters, and say, sir, you mustn't forget your manners. Tom Sawyer, sir. That's it. That's a good boy, fine manly little fellow. 2,000 verses is a great many, and very, very great many. And you never can be sorry for the trouble you took to learn them, for knowledge is worth more than anything there is in the world. It's what makes great men and good men. You'll be a great man and a good man yourself someday, Thomas, and you'll look back and say, it's all owing to the precious Sunday school privileges of my boyhood. It's all owing to my dear teachers that taught me to learn. It's all owing to the good superintendent who encouraged me and watched over me and gave me a beautiful Bible, a splendid, elegant Bible to keep and to have it for your own always. It's all owing to right bringing up. That is what you will say, Thomas, and you wouldn't make any money for those 2,000 verses. No, indeed you wouldn't. And now you wouldn't mind telling me and this lady some of the things you've learned. No, I know you wouldn't, for you are proud of little boys that learn. Now, no doubt you know the names of all the 12 disciples. Won't you tell us the names of the first two that you were appointed? Tom was tugging at a buttonhole and looking sheepish. He blushed now and his eyes fell. Mr. Walters' heart sank within him. He said to himself, it is not possible that boy can answer the simple question. Why did the judge ask him? Yet he felt obliged to speak up and say, answer the gentleman, Thomas. Don't be afraid. Thomas still hung fire. Now, I know you'll tell me, said the lady. The names of the first two disciples were David and Goliath. Let us draw a curtain of charity over the rest of the scene. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. About 10:30, the cracked bell of the small church began to ring, and presently the people began to gather for the morning sermon. The Sunday school children distributed themselves about the house and occupied pews with their parents, so as to be under supervision. Aunt Polly came, and Tom and Sid and Mary sat with her, Tom being placed next to the aisle in order that he might be as far away from the open window and the seductive outside summer scenes as possible. The crowd filed up the aisles, the aged and the needy postmaster, who had seen better days, the mayor and his wife, for they had a mayor there among other unnecessaries, the justice of the peace, the widow Douglas, fair, smart, and 40, a generous, good-hearted soul, and well-to-do, her hill mansion the only place in town, and the most hospitable, and much the most lavish in the matter of festivities that St. Petersburg could boast. The bent and venerable Major and Mrs. Ward, Lawyer Riberson, and new notable from a distance next to the belle of the village, followed by a troop of lawn-clad and ribbon-decked young heartbreakers, then all the young clerks in town in a body, for they had stood in the vestibule sucking their cane heads and circling walls of oiled and simpering admirers till the last girl had run their gauntlet. And last of all came the model boy, Willie Mufferson, taking as heedful care of his mother as if she were cut glass. He always brought his mother to church and was the pride of all the matrons. The boys all hated him, and he was so good. And besides, he had been thrown up to them so much. His white handkerchief was hanging out of his pocket behind, as usual on Sundays, accidentally. Tom had no handkerchief, and he looked upon boys who had as snobs. The congregation being fully assembled now, the bell rang once more to warn laggards and stragglers, and then a solemn hush fell upon the church, which was only broken by the tittering and whispering of the choir in the gallery. The choir always tittered and whispered all through the service. There was once a church choir that was not ill-bred, but I've forgotten where it was now. It was a great many years ago, and I can scarcely remember anything about it, but I think it was in some foreign country. The minister gave out the hymn and read it through with a relish in a particular style that was much admired in that part of the country. His voice began on a medium key and climbed steadily up till it reached a certain point, where it bore with strong emphasis upon the topmost word and then plunged down as if it were from a springboard. Shall I be carried towards the skies on flowery beds of ease, whilst others fight to win the prize, a sailor through bloody seas. He was regarded as a wonderful reader. At church socials, he was always called upon to read poetry, and when he was through, the ladies would lift up their hands and let them fall helplessly at their laps, and wall their eyes and shake their heads, as much as to say, words cannot express it. It is too beautiful for this mortal earth. After the hymn had been sung, the Reverend Mr. Sprague turned himself into a bulletin board and read off notices of meetings and societies and things till it seemed that the list would stretch out to the crack of doom. A queer custom which is still kept up in America, even in cities away here in this age of abundant newspapers. Often, the less there is to justify a traditional custom, the harder it is to get rid of it. And now the minister prayed. A good, generous prayer it was, and it went into details. It pleaded for the church and the little children of the church, for other churches in the village, for the village itself, for the county, for the state officers, for the United States, for the churches of the United States, the Congress, for the president, for the officers of government, for poor sailors tossed by stormy seas, for the oppressed millions groaning under the heel of European monarchies and Oriental despotism, for such as have the light and the good tidings and yet have not eyes to see, nor ears to hear withal. For the heathen in far islands of the sea, and closed with supplication that the words he was about to speak might find grace and favor, and be as seed sown in fertile ground, yielding in time a grateful harvest of good. Amen. There was a rustling of dresses, and the standing congregation sat down. The boy whose history this book relates did not enjoy the prayer. He only endured it, if he even did that much. He was restive all through it, and he kept a tally of the details of the prayer unconsciously, for he was not listening. But he knew the ground of the old, and the clergyman regularly route over it. And when a little trifle of new matter was interlarded, his ears detected it, and his whole nature resented it. He considered additions unfair and scoundrelly. In the midst of the prayer, a fly had lit on the back of the pew in front of him and tortured his spirit by calmingly rubbing his hands together, embracing its head with its arms, and polishing it so vigorously that it seemed to almost part company with the body. And the slender thread of the neck was exposed to view, scraping its wings with its hind legs and soothing them to his body as if they had been coattails, going through its whole toilet of tranquility as if it knew it was perfectly safe. As indeed it was, for as sorely as Tom's hands itched to grab for it, they did not dare. He believed his soul would be instantly destroyed if he did such a thing while the prayer was going on. But with the closing sentence, his hand began to curve and steal forward, and the instant the amen was out, the fly was a prisoner of war. His aunt detected the act and made him let it go. The minister gave out his text and droned along monotonously through an argument that was so prosy that many a head by and by began to nod. And yet it was an argument that dealt in limitless fire and brimstone and thinned the predestined elect down to a company so small as to be hardly worth the saving. Tom counted the pages of the sermon. After church, he always knew how many pages there had been, but he seldom knew anything else about the discourse. However, this time he was really interested for a little while. The minister made a grand and moving picture of the assembling together of the world's hosts at the millennium, when the lion and the lamb should lie down together, and a little child should lead them. But the pathos, the lesson, the moral, the great spectacle were lost upon the boy. He only thought of the conspicuousness of the principal character before the onlooking nations. His face lit with the thought, and he said to himself that he wished he could be that child, if it was to tame a lion. Now he lapsed into suffering again as the dry argument was resumed. Presently he bethought him of a treasure he had and got it out. It was a large black beetle with formidable jaws, a pinch bug he called it. It was in a percussion cap box. The first thing the beetle did was to take him by the finger. A natural flippet followed. The beetle went floundering into the aisle and lit on its back, and the hurt finger went into the boy's mouth. The beetle lay there working its helpless legs, unable to turn over. Tom eyed it and longed for it, but it was safe out of his reach. Other people, uninterested in the sermon, found relief in the beetle, and they eyed it too. Presently, a vagrant poodle dog came idling along, sad at heart, lazy with summer softness, and quiet, weary of captivity, sighing for change. He spied the beetle. The drooping tail lifted and wagged. He surveyed the prize, walked around it, smelt at it from the safe distance, walked around it again, grew bolder and took a closer smell, then lifted his lip and made a gingerly snatch at it, just missing it, made another and another, began to enjoy the diversion, subsided to his stomach with the beetle between his paws, and continued this experiment. Grew weary at last, and then indifferent, and then absent-minded. His head nodded, and little by little his chin descended and touched the enemy, who seized it. There was a sharp yelp and a flirt of the poodle's head, and the beetle fell a couple yards away and lit on its back once more. The neighboring spectators shook with a gentle inward joy. Several faces went behind fans and handkerchiefs, and Tom was entirely happy. The dog looked foolish and probably felt so. But there was resentment in his heart, too, and a craving for revenge, so he went to the beetle and began a wary attack at it again, jumping it from every point of the circle, lighting with his forepaws within an inch of the creature, making even closer snatches at it with his teeth, and jerking his head until his ears flapped again. But he grew tired once more, and after a while tried to amuse himself with a fly, but found no relief. Followed an ant around with its nose close to the floor, and quickly wearied of that. Yawned, sighed, forgot the beetle entirely, and sat down on it. Then there was a wild yelp of agony, and the poodle went sailing up the aisle. The yelps continued, and so did the dog. He crossed the house in front of the altar and flew down the other aisle and crossed before the doors. He clambered up the home stretch. His anguish grew with his progress, till presently he was but a woolly comet moving in its orbit with the gleam and the speed of light. At last the frantic sufferer, sheared from his course, sprang into its master's lap, and he flung it out the window, and the voices of distress quickly thinned away and died in the distance. By this time, the whole church was red-faced and suffocating with suppressed laughter, and the sermon had come to a dead standstill. The discourse was resumed presently, but it went lame and halting, all possibility of impressiveness being at its end. For even the gravest sentiments were constantly being received with a smothered burst of unholy mirth. Under cover of some remote pew back, as if the poor parson had said a rarely facetious thing, it was a genuine relief to the whole congregation when the ordeal was over and the benediction pronounced. Tom Sawyer went home quite cheerful, thinking to himself that there was some satisfaction about the divine service when there was a bit of variety in it. He had but one marring thought. He was willing that the dog shouldn't play with a pinch bug, but he did not think it was the upright in him to carry it off. The end of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Monday morning found Tom Sawyer miserable. Monday mornings always found him so, because it began another week's slow suffering in school. He generally began that day with wishing he had had no intervening holiday. It made the going into captivity and fetters again so much more odious. Tom lay thinking. Presently occurred to him that he wished he was sick. Then he could stay home from school. Here was a vague possibility. He canvassed his system, no ailment found, and he investigated again. This time he thought he could detect colicky symptoms, began to encourage them with considerable hope. But they soon grew feeble and presently died wholly away. He reflected further. Suddenly he discovered something. one of his upper front teeth was loose. This was lucky. He was about to begin to groan, as a starter, as he called it, when it occurred to him that if he came into court with that argument, his aunt would pull it out, and that would hurt. So he thought he would hold the tooth in reserve for the present and seek further. Nothing offered for some little time, and then he remembered hearing the doctor tell about a certain thing that laid up a patient for 2 or 3 weeks and threatened to make him lose a finger. So the boy eagerly drew his sore toe from under the sheet and held it up for inspection. But now he did not know the necessary symptoms. However, it seemed worthwhile to chance it, so he fell to groaning with considerable spirit. But Sid slept unconscious. Tom groaned louder and fancied that he began to feel the pain in his toe. No result from Sid. Tom was panting with exertions by this time. He took a rest and then swelled himself up and fetched the succession of admirable groans. Sid snored on. Tom was aggravated. He said, "Sid, Sid," and shook him. This course worked well, and Tom began to groan again. Sid yawned and stretched, then brought himself up on his elbow with a snort and began to stare at Tom. Tom went on groaning. Sid said, "Tom, say Tom." No response. "Here, Tom. Tom, what is the matter, Tom?" And he shook him and looked at his face anxiously. Tom moaned out, "Oh, don't, Sid, don't joggle me." "Why, what's the matter, Tom? I must call Auntie." "No, never mind. It'll be over by and by. Maybe. Don't call anybody." "But I must. Don't groan so, Tom. It's awful. How long have you been this way?" "Hours. Ouch. Oh, don't stir so, Sid. You'll kill me." "Tom, why didn't you wake me sooner?" "Oh, Tom, don't. It makes my flesh crawl to hear you. Tom, what is the matter?" "I forgive you everything, Sid. Oh, everything you've ever done to me. When I'm gone..." "Oh, Tom, you ain't dying, are you?" "Don't, Tom. Oh, don't. Maybe..." "I forgive everybody, Sid." "Oh, tell him so, Sid. And Sid, you give my window sash and my cat with one eye to that new girl that's come to town. And tell her..." But Sid snatched his clothes and was gone. Tom was suffering in reality now. So handsomely was his imagination working, and so his groans had gathered quite a genuine tone. Sid flew downstairs and said, "Oh, Aunt Polly, come. Tom's dying." "Dying?" "Yes'm, don't wait. Come quick." "Rubbish, I don't believe it." But she fled upstairs, nevertheless, with Sid and Mary at her heels. And her face grew white, too, and her lips trembled. When she reached the bedside, she gasped out, "You, Tom, what's the matter with you?" "Oh, Auntie, What's the matter with you? What is the matter with you, child?" "Oh, Auntie, my sore toe's mortified." The old lady sank down into a chair and laughed a little, then cried a little, then did both together. This restored her, and she said, "Tom, what a turn you did give me. Now you shut up that nonsense and climb out of this." The groans ceased and the pain vanished from the toe. The boy felt a little foolish, and he said, "Aunt Polly, it seemed mortified, and it hurt, so I never minded my tooth at all." "Your tooth, indeed. What's the matter with your tooth?" "One of them's loose, and it aches perfectly awful." There, now don't begin that groaning again. Open your mouth." "Well, your tooth is loose, but you're not going to die about that. Mary, get me a silk thread and a chunk of fire out of the kitchen." Tom said, "Oh, please, Auntie, don't pull it out. It don't hurt anymore. I wish I may never stir if it does." "Please don't, Auntie. I don't want to stay home from school." "Oh, you don't, do you? So all this row was because you thought you'd get to stay home from school and go a-fishing?" Tom, I love you so, and you seem to try every way you can to break my old heart with your outrageousness." By this time, the dental instruments were ready. The old lady made one end of the silk thread fast to Tom's tooth with a loop and tied the other to the bedpost. Then she seized a chunk of fire and suddenly thrust it almost into the boy's face. The tooth hung dangling by the bedpost now. But all the trials bring their compensations. As Tom wended to school after breakfast, he was the envy of every boy he met because the gap in his upper row of teeth enabled him to exasperate in a new and admirable way. He gathered quite a following of lads interested in the exhibition, and one that had cut his finger and had been the center of fascination and homage up to this time, now found himself suddenly without adherent and shorn of his glory. His heart was heavy, and he said with disdain, which he did not feel, that it wasn't anything to spit like Tom Sawyer. But another boy said, "Sour grapes," and he wandered away from this dismantled hero. Shortly, Tom came upon a juvenile pariah of the village, Huckleberry Finn, son of the town drunkard. Huckleberry was cordially hated and dreaded by all the mothers of the town because he was idle and lawless and vulgar and bad, and because all their children admired him so, and delighted in his forbidden society, and wished they dared to be like him. Tom was like the rest of the respectable boys in that he envied Huckleberry his gaudy outcast condition, and was under strict orders not to play with him. So he played with him every time he got a chance. Huckleberry was always dressed in cast-off clothes of full-grown men, and they were in perennial bloom and fluttering with rags. His hat was a vast ruin with a wide crest lopped out of its brim. His coat, when he wore one, hung nearly to his heels and had the rearward buttons far down his back. But one suspender supported his trousers. The seat of his trousers bagged low and contained nothing. The fringed legs dragged in the dirt when not rolled up. Huckleberry came and went at his own free will. He slept on doorsteps in fine weather and in empty hogsheads in the wet. He did not have to go to school or to church or call any being master or obey anybody. He could go fishing or swimming when and where he chose and stayed as long as it suited him. Nobody forbade him to fight. He could sit up as late as he pleased. He was always the first boy that went barefoot in the spring and the last to resume leather in the fall. He never had to wash or put on clean clothes. He could swear wonderfully. In a word, everything that goes to make life precious, that boy had. So thought every harassed, hampered, respectable boy in St. Petersburg. Tom hailed the romantic outcast. "Hello, Huckleberry." "Hello yourself, and see how you like it." "What's that you got?" "Dead cat." "Let me see him, Huck. My, he's pretty stiff. Where'd you get him?" "Bought him off a boy." "What'd you give?" "I give a blue sticker and a bladder that I got at a slaughterhouse." "Where'd you get the blue ticket?" "Bought it off of Ben Rogers 2 weeks ago for a hoopstick." "Say, what is dead cats good for, Huck?" "Good for? Cure warts with." "No, is that so? I know something that's better." "Bet you don't. What is it?" "Why, spunk water." "Spunk water? I wouldn't give a darn for spunk water." "You wouldn't, would you? Did you ever try it?" "No, I hain't, but Bob Tanner did." "Who told you so?" "Why, he told Jeff Thatcher, and Jeff told Johnny Baker, and Johnny told Jim Hollis, and Jim told Ben Rogers, and Ben told a nigger, and the nigger told me. There now." "Well, what of it? They all lie. Leastways, all but the nigger. I don't know him, but I never see a nigger that wouldn't lie. Shucks. Now you tell me how Bob Tanner done it, Huck." "Why, he took and dipped his hand in a rotten stump where the rainwater was." "In the daytime?" "Certainly." "With his face on the stump?" "Yes, less I reckon so." "Did he say anything?" "I don't reckon he did. I don't know." "Ah." Talk about trying to cure warts with spunk water such a blame fool way as that. Why, they ain't a-goin' do no any good. You gotta go all by yourself to the middle of the woods where you know there's spunk water stump. And just as it's midnight, you back up against the stump and jam your hand in and say, barley corn, Injun meal shorts, spunk water, swallow these warts. And then walk away quick, 11 steps with your eyes shut, then turn around 3 times and walk home without speaking to anybody. Because if you speak, the charm's busted. Well, that sounds like a good way, but that ain't the way Bob Tanner done. No, sir, you can bet he didn't, because he's the wartiest boy in this town. He wouldn't have wart on him if he'd knowed how to work spunk water. I've took off thousands of warts off my hands that way, Huck. I play with frogs so much that I've always got considerable many warts. Sometimes I take them off with a bean. Yeah, bean's good. I've done that. Have you? What's your way? You take and split the bean and cut the wart as to get some blood, and then you put the blood on one piece of bean and take and dig a hole and bury it. About midnight at the crossroads in the dark of the moon, then you burn up the rest of the bean. You see, that piece that's got the blood on it will keep drawing and drawing, trying to fetch the other piece to it. And so that helps the blood to draw the wart, and pretty soon she comes off. Yes, that's it, Huck, that's it. Though when you're burying it, if you say, down bean, off wart, come no more and bother me, it's better. That's the way Joe Harper does, and he's been nearly to Coonville and almost everywheres. But say, how do you cure 'em with dead cats? Why, you take your cat and go and get in the graveyard long about midnight when somebody that was wicked has been buried, and when it's midnight, a devil will come, or maybe 2 or 3, but you can't see him. You can only hear something like the wind, or maybe hear him talk. And when they're taking that feller away, you heave your cat after him and say, devil follow corpse, cat follow devil, warts follow cat. I'm done with ye. That'll fetch any wart. Sounds right. Did you ever try it, Huck? No, but old Mother Hopkins told me. Well, I reckon it's so then, because they say she's a witch. Say, why, Tom, I know she is. She witched Pop, and Pap says so his own self. He come along one day and he sees she's a witching him, so he took up a rock, and if she hadn't dodged, he'd have got her. Well, that night he rolled off in a shed where he was laying drunk and broke his arm. Why, that's awful. How did he know she was a witching him? Lord, Pap can tell easy. Pap says when they keep looking at you right steady, they're witching you, especially if they mumble, because when they mumble, they're saying the Lord's Prayer backwards. Say, Hucky, when are you going to try the cat? Tonight. I reckon they'll come after old Hoss Williams tonight. But they buried him Saturday. Didn't they get him Saturday night? Why, how you talk? How could their charms work until midnight? And then it's Sunday. Devils don't slosh around much on Sunday, I don't reckon. Oh, I never thought of that. Not so. Let me go with you. Of course, if ye ain't afeard. Afeard? 'Tain't likely. Will you meow? Yes, and you meow back. If you get a chance, last time you kept me meowing around till old Hayes went throwing rocks at me and says, darn that cat. So I hove a brick through his window. But don't you tell. I won't. I couldn't meow all night because my auntie was watching me. But I'll meow this time. Say, what's that? Nothing but a tick. Where'd you get him? Out in the woods. What'll you take for him? Oh, I don't know. I don't want to sell him. All right, it's a mighty small tick anyway. Oh, anybody can run a tick down. That don't belong to him. I'm satisfied with it. It's a good enough tick for me. Sure, there's ticks aplenty. I could have 1,000 if I wanted to. Well, why don't you? because you know mighty well you can't. This is a pretty early tick, I reckon. It's the first one I've seen this year. Say, Huck, I'll give you my tooth for him. Let's see it. Tom got out a bit of paper and carefully unrolled it. Huckleberry viewed it wistfully. The temptation was very strong. At last he said, "Is it genuine?" Tom lifted his lip and showed the vacancy. "Well, all right," said Huckleberry. "It's a trade." Tom enclosed a tick in the percussion cap box that had lately been the pinch bug's prison, and the boys separated, each feeling wealthier than before. When Tom reached the little isolated frame schoolhouse, he strode in briskly with the manner of one who had come with all honest speed. He hung his hat on a peg and flung himself into his seat with business-like alacrity. The master, throned on high in his great splint-bottomed armchair, was dozing, lulled by a drowsy hum of study. The interruption roused him. "Thomas Sawyer?" Tom knew that when his name was pronounced in full, it meant trouble. "Sir, come up here." "Now, sir, why are you late again, as usual?" Tom was about to take refuge in a lie when he saw two long tails of yellow hair hanging down at the back, and he recognized by the electricity symphony of love. And by that form was the only vacant place on the schoolgirls' side of the schoolhouse. He instantly said, "I stopped to talk to Huckleberry Finn." The master pulse stood still and he stared helplessly. The buzz of study ceased. The pupils wondered if this foolhardy boy had lost his mind. The master said, You did what?" "I stopped to talk to Huckleberry Finn." There was no mistaking his words. "Thomas Sawyer, this is the most astounding confession I have ever listened to. No mere ferule will answer for this offense. Take off your jacket." The master's arm performed it until he was tired and the stock of switches noticeably diminished. Then the order followed. "Now, sir, go and sit with the girls and let this be a warning to you." The titter that rippled around the room appeared to abash the boy, but in reality the result was caused rather more by his worshipful awe of this unknown idol and the dread pleasure that lay in his high good fortune. He sat down upon the end of the pine bench, and the girl hitched herself away from him with a toss of her head. Nudges and winks and whispers traversed the room, but Tom sat still with his arms hung upon the long, low desk before him and seemed to study his book. By and by, attention ceased from him, and the accustomed school murmur rose upon the dull air once more. Presently, the boy began to steal a furtive glance at the girl. She observed it, made a mouth at him, and gave him the back of her head for the space of a minute. When she cautiously faced him around again, a peach lay before her. She thrust it away. Tom gently put it back. She thrust it away again, but with less animosity. Tom patiently returned it to its place. Then she let it remain. Tom scrawled on his slate, "Please take it. I've got more." The girl glanced at the words but made no sign. Now the boy began to draw something on the slate, hiding his work with his left hand. For a time the girl refused to notice, but her human curiosity presently began to manifest itself by hardly perceptible signs. The boy worked on, apparently unconscious. The boy made a sort of non-committal attempt to see, but the boy did not betray that he was aware of it. At last she gave in and hesitantly whispered, "Let me see it." Tom partly uncovered the dismal caricature of a house with two gable ends to it and a corkscrew of smoke issuing from the chimney. Then the girl's interest began to fasten itself back upon the work, and she forgot everything else. When it was finished, she gazed a moment, then whispered, "It's nice. Make a man." The artist erected the man in the front yard that resembled a derrick. He could have stepped over the house, but the girl was not hypocritical. She was satisfied with the monster and whispered, "It's a beautiful man. Now make me coming along." Tom drew an hourglass with a full moon and straw limbs to it. and armed the spreading fingers with a porch's fan. The girl said, "It's ever so nice. I wish I could draw." "It's easy," whispered Tom. "I'll learn you." "Oh, you will? When?" "At noon. Do you go home to dinner?" "I'll stay if you will." "Good. That's a whack. What's your name?" "Becky Thatcher. What's yours?" "Oh, I know. It's Thomas Sawyer." "That's the name they lick me by. I'm Tom when I'm good. You can call me Tom, will you?" "Yes." Now Tom began to scrawl something on the slate, hiding the words from the girl. But she was not backward this time. She begged to see it. Tom said, "Oh, it ain't anything." "Yes, it is." "No, it ain't. You don't want to see." "Yes, I do. Indeed, I do. Please let me." "You'll tell." "No, I won't. Deed and double deed won't." "You won't tell anybody at all? Ever, as long as you live?" "No, I won't ever tell anybody. Now let me." "Oh, you don't want to see." "Now that you treat me so, I will see." And she put her small hand upon his, and a little scuffle ensued. Tom pretending to resist in earnest, but letting his hand slip by degrees till the words were revealed. "I love you." "Oh, you bad thing." And she hit him his hand with a smart rap, but reddened and looked pleased nevertheless. Just at this juncture, the boy felt a slow, fateful grip closing on his ear, a steady lifting impulse. In that wise, he was borne across the house, depositing in his own seat under a peppering fire of giggles from the whole school. Then the master stood over him during the few awful moments and finally moved away to his throne without saying a word. But although Tom's ear tingled, his heart was jubilant. As school quieted down, Tom made an honest effort to study, but the turmoil within him was too great. In turn, he took his place in the reading class and made a botch of it. Then in geography class, and turned lakes into mountains and mountains into rivers and rivers into continents till chaos was come again. Then in spelling class, and got turned down by a succession of mere baby words till he brought up at the foot and yelled up at the pewter medal which he had worn with ostentation for months. End of chapter 6.